or wanted...
No, wait, start over, now.
Aegon the Conqueror wanted all of Westeros south of the Wall. Not most of it. All of it. From his perspective, he had been relatively patient. With few exceptions, the majority of the realm had bent the knee to the Iron Throne during the conquest. That's why they called it the conquest. Now, years are enumerated by the abbreviation AC, which stands for after the conquest. It wasn't until the year 4 AC that attacks on Dorne began. So there was, as we talked about last time in the Dragon's Interim, a good bit of time between when hostilities broke out. Queen Rhaenys had promised to return with fire and blood, and she did. But Meria told her to Meria told her to remember the words of House Martell. Words echoed throughout Dorne on rare occasions such as this. An outside invasion is the best time for unbowed, unbent, unbroken to be all of Dorne's motto, not just the words of their princely house. They're all Martells in terms of this attitude when the dragons come, or when anyone comes, but especially the dragons. But what do those words actually mean when faced with dragons and large armies? It's a difficult proposition, but Aegon might have been a bit overconfident given his earlier successes, and the Dornish might have been confident in that and some other factors. You might be familiar with the general idea of what happens to invaders, even dragon-riding invaders, in those deep deserts. But this is before the Targaryens knew that. They hadn't tried this before. This was new to them. Now, it wasn't new to some of the people in their armies, but it was new to House Targaryen. We get to watch them learn the hard way. Let's put it that way. We'll discuss what he did right, what he did wrong, same goes for his sub-commanders, and what made Dorne so different. How is it that Aegon had such an easy time with all the rest of the realm, yet such a hard time south of the Red Mountains? Plus, a lot of these lessons are going to be, or not, learned by future Targaryens, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome back to another Sunday afternoon if you're here live. Otherwise, whatever day you're listening to this, welcome, and know that we recorded it on a Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. So if you are inclined to watch us live, that's the time to do it. Afterwards, every video stays up on YouTube and also gets posted on Spotify, and the audio-only version is available everywhere you listen to podcasts, and it's ad-free if you listen on Patreon. Our Topics Moot is coming soon. Get yourself ready, get signed up on our Patreon, and participate in the choosing of what will be this year 12 topics, and in future years we might do more than that. So be a part of the first ever Topics Moot. And if you're hearing this later, be a part of the second or third or fourth, whenever that happens to be. Hey, Sean, how's it going? Good to see you there. You excited to talk about this episode today?
Yeah, I'm mostly excited. It's I got to say, this whole storyline is frustrating to me. Like, yeah. Can't we all just get along, you know?
Well, it's in the right place for this sort of thing. When it's real, it's frustrating, and that's why you feel it that way. But we get to remind ourselves it's not. But it does relate to things in the real world. A lot of realistic things, a lot of ideas that we can maybe bring ourselves to try to imagine. Not too much, like you don't want to imagine yourself being in a war like this, but we're going to do it a little bit anyway. We're going to try to put ourselves in the boots of some of the soldiers on the ground, in the desert, and some of these tough spots. I think that's what makes some of these topics particularly interesting is picturing yourself there, imagining yourself in it, or imagining someone else in it. Imagining yourself watching it maybe is a more pleasant way to experience that. But yeah, it's not pleasant overall though, is it?
Yeah, I think that's a common way people, definitely me, but I think I'm not unique in this, that people approach how they consume media, books or TV shows or whatever. A lot of the time, what's going through your head is, what would I do? I would have done this. They should do this. You know, you're constantly thinking about like what woulda, coulda, shoulda happened, how you would have done it differently. And to be fair, a lot of times if I or a objective, rational person was in that situation, there wouldn't be this conflict in the first place, and we wouldn't have this media.
That's true. Also, you would have different attitudes about everything. You wouldn't have 2023 sensibilities. You would have Dornish in 4AC sensibilities or Westeros, whatever part of the realm you're from.
I'm living with 2024 sensibilities. I think you should catch up.
I haven't moved on yet. I'm living in the past. That joke never gets old when you forget what year it is, when you forget to turn the calendar. I'm living in the past. That's right. Yeah. Haha. You've never heard that one before. Speaking of you've never heard that before, the latest question posed to Nina on her blog, goodqueenellie.com, or .tumblr.com, excuse me, is written as, sorry if you've been asked this before, but where was Princess Elia and her entourage headed when Ulmer of the Kingswood Brotherhood stole a kiss from her? Good question. Where were they going? What was the deal? Who else was there? And was it around the time that Rhaegar unhorsed Simon Toyne? So, really good question. Really interesting episode that happened not long before the rebellion. So you want to read Nina's take on that and see what she says. It's a good one. If you have questions of your own that you want to direct towards us, you can send them to westeroshistory@gmail.com, or you can ask live during a live stream. At the end of this episode, I'll mention some episodes that relate to this one. If you want to stay immersed, you can go check those out. And I'll also give you the answer to this trivia question. What sigil did House Toland have prior to the First Dornish War? In this episode, it's going to change. So if you listen carefully, you'll get the answer. Last time we discussed the first few years of Aegon's reign. The final subtopic we covered was the peaceful attempts to bring Dorne into the realm. We wondered what those attempts were comprised of, what kind of offers or threats or both were made. But regardless, didn't work, so it's not super important, just a curiosity. So that takes us to this nice summary-style quote from Fire and Blood about the big picture. Quote,
"The long reign of King Aegon I Targaryen, 1 AC to 37 AC, was, by and large, a peaceful one, in his later years especially. But before the Dragon's Peace, as the last 2 decades of his kingship called by the Maesters of the Citadel, came the Dragon's Wars, the last of which was as cruel and bloody a conflict as any ever fought in Westeros."
Since this is a reread for most of you listening, you might have nodded in agreement at that last line when you first read or heard it, and perhaps again just now, because yes, it is as cruel and bloody a conflict as any ever fought in Westeros, which is what Sean was talking about at the beginning about it being frustrating and awfully violent. Yes, indeed, it really is. And you thought of a few parallels to kick us off with wars that get really bogged down, wars that get really bloody, and very little progress gets made on either side, either towards peace or towards ending a war, one way or the other.
There are many, many examples, but a couple I thought might be particularly apropos are because George would have lived through them. They might have been, certainly in his brain, if not at the forefront of his brain, was the U.S. and Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that was a scenario where it was, overwhelming forces, right? Like the U.S. hugely had, more manpower, technology and whatnot than Vietnam. And, there's a bunch of reasons, like political reasons why we weren't fully committed, right? There just as a policy, we weren't trying to take over Vietnam. We were just trying to stop Soviets from taking over. So we were just sitting there waiting for them to attack us. And they were using guerrilla warfare, right? Which was difficult to fight against. Even when you have like jet planes in the air or whatever, how does that stop people like in tunnels, hiding out in a jungle, things like that? That war, by the way, lasted approximately, the U.S. involvement was approximately 10 years from, when Johnson sent significant ground forces in 1965 to when we're like pulling people out by helicopter in Saigon in 1975. This war was also about 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And the USSR in Afghanistan is also something that would have been in George's life.
Very true.
But we're leading up to the writing of the books and also lasted almost exactly 10 years. It was 1980 to 1989, I think, that Soviets put forces in until they pulled them out. Again, huge, overwhelming forces, this time in more of a desertous landscape with maybe some more similarities to Dorne there. But they were determined to take over and were not successful. 10 years of guerrilla warfare, and the people there, they didn't have like huge cities that could be like choked off or destroyed that then shut the country down and made them surrender. They were just scattered population through the countryside and the mountainside, just like Dorne. You could attack.
They were
little
unbowed,
segments of them,
unbent,
but-
unbroken. Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
They didn't give up. They didn't just say, "Okay, well, we can go back to our normal lives under these conquerors." That's one thing that sometimes is a consideration, I think. But yeah, these are great examples, Sean, because for example, Vietnam, one of the big things there was tunnels, and here in Dorne, there's lots of caves. So not the same thing. They're not digging tunnels, but caves are effectively the same thing because they are a refuge from air power. It's harder to get bombed when you're up in a tunnel. You can't get seen or scouted. Of course, the jungles help with that too, which there aren't in Dorne. But that's where Afghanistan has more similarity because it's deserty and mountainy and dry and water and supplies are really hard to get a hold of.
And, one thing that we tried to do to deal with the jungle aspect was napalm. We would rain fire
Huge
down.
amounts of fire,
right?
yeah.
Just like the dragons. And that would have been another.
Like what Rhaenys did in the Stormlands. Yeah, near when the armies were ambushing them, they just started just torching the entire forest. Like, okay, you're going to hide in the forest, we're going to destroy the forest. Yeah, you're right. That's an extremely strong parallel. So let's talk about when this started. We can be pretty sure winter came to Westeros in the 5th year after the conquest because it was the 2nd year of autumn already in AC4. So they had 2 straight years of autumn, which is a dead giveaway that winter is soon. Winter is soon. What am I saying? Winter is coming, right? I just totally used the wrong slogan. Wow. So that means the campaign started in autumn, which is an interesting choice. Now, this was on purpose. They weren't just bumbling around saying, okay, well, we'll just go attack without any consideration to what the weather was going to be like. They thought it was going to help them because, well, it's hot and dry in Dorne, and if it's autumn, that should mitigate some of that heat. It should be cooler and the water would be more plentiful. And they weren't entirely wrong, but it wasn't as much of a difference as they probably would have hoped for. I mean, it's like that thing. Remember, Sean, the Futurama joke when the aliens come because they're mad that Single Female Lawyer was canceled? It's like, we will raise the temperature of your planet 1 million degrees a day for 5 days. It's like, we're all dead after that first day. It's the same thing here. Like, a little more water isn't going to save you from dying when you have no water. 2 drops of water isn't much better.
Or, 94 degrees instead of 112 degrees. 112 is extreme and tough to deal with. But if it's 94 instead, that's better, I guess. But you're still the horses aren't going to make it. The armor's going to bake you. There's too many problems.
Or 112 without water or 94 without water. I mean, you're still without
honestly,
water. Either way, you're
without water.
Screwed.
Right?
Without
water would still be a problem. Even if you did have water, because you got to keep in mind too, it's not like they just have to exist there. They have to travel hundreds of miles and then fight, right? And they have to keep their horses fed and watered. It's not, they can't just barely survive. This is supposed to be a long march to war. And so they don't even make it through the long march. I don't even know if they had double the water and 10 degrees cooler, I still don't know if they were going to make it because they're being ambushed on the way. It's not just a march. It's a march through enemy territory. It's too much.
It's sort of like the example that's cited a lot in the real world. Don't try to invade Russia in the winter.
Yeah.
Maybe just don't try to invade Russia at all, But if you do it in the winter, it's terrible. And you might get wrong what winter means. They're like, oh, winter is in these certain months, and then the rest of the time it's fine. It's like, no, it's hot all the time in Dorne. It's just worse in some of the other months. Yeah. So they mistook some of the ideas here. I think they overestimated what difference the weather would make. And they may have overestimated some other stuff too. They may have expected that the peasantry, the commoners, and maybe even some of the lords and knights would capitulate quicker because of supplies and their own fear of being short during the winter. If we go to war now, that's going to burn up more resources than it would if we were just chilling at home, right? We don't have to go on these long marches and burn so many thousands of calories a day just to keep going and you go through our supplies a lot faster. That if you're sitting at home at winter, you're not going through your stuff as quick. So they might have expected that the Dornish would fear that, and that would make them give up quicker, which is part of that, how they started with their strategy. And well, it didn't work, but in theory, it's not the worst idea, but yeah, it didn't work out. Now, winter isn't going to be all that bad in Dorne anyway, but they still need things like bringing their own supplies down. You can't carry all your supplies, right, with you at all times. They have to, especially armies of tens of thousands, have to constantly re-up their supplies. They can't just have enough for them at all times. That's ridiculous, right? So a lot of times that's done with shipping, with boats. You have boats that are near your armies, and those boats, those navies can supply your main columns. That is something that Alexander the Great did, something that Genghis Khan did. There's just all the conquerors did things like this. Not all, but it's a common strategy amongst conquerors. But, so there's two quirks here. One is, well, it's harder to sail in winter, or in autumn and then winter. That's a well-known thing in Westeros, especially that side of the continent. Autumn storms are nasty. They're vicious. So relying on supplies to be shipped in is pretty sketchy. Now, Sean, when we were talking about this ahead of time, you also pointed out that there's certain areas of Dorne that you just can't ship supplies to. When that's very accurate. The southern coast of Dorne, not very good. Now, they're not operating all that much down there anyway, but it's a good example that that's not an option to them. That they might have operated more down there if they had more access.
Even the northern coast, you still have to go down through those mountain passes and then across the desert to reach where hopefully ships are there with supplies. Like, say you don't meet up at the same time. Even if they did coordinate that just perfectly, they barely made it through the mountain passes, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It was, I feel like it was a mistake to not use the boats, but that's not really the mistake that did them in.
Yeah, it's one of many mistakes, yeah.
The mistake, I think, was to not bring the troops on the boats in the first place. That's what they should have done, is rather than try to walk down to the mountains and in across the desert, potentially to link up resupply from boats, they should have just been dropped off by the boats in the first. Now, the problem with that is they probably didn't have that many boats, right? That's a lot of boats to carry tens of thousands of soldiers, and we know that a significant portion of the Navy was just destroyed in the past couple of years. So,
you're totally right. There's another logistical issue here as well, which is that the bulk of the troops are coming from the Reach, and not just the Reach, but the southern portion of the Reach, which is around Highgarden, which would mean if they wanted to take ship, they'd have to march a substantial way to get to whatever ships they were going to use. Like if it's the Arbor, bringing the ships up to ship them down there. And then they'd have to go all the way around Dorne. Because the one good place to land in Dorne is northern Dorne, the southern coast of the Sea of Dorne, which, you can go across that sea and get into the Stormlands. That's the only reasonable place for boats to operate, which is still a play area racked by storms. So they'd have to sail all the way from Highgarden, all the way around the southern coast of Dorne, which is a bad place for sailing, and then all the way up to the north, and then have all those supplies. Yeah, so...
Or potentially they could have marched from the Reach over to King's Landing.
Yeah.
And come down from the southern coast of the Sea of Dorne.
But which you just mentioned, they don't have ships anymore because the Valyrian Navy was destroyed. So they'd have to, so there's all sorts of issues.
All those problems, as bad as they are, I think are less bad than what ended up happening, though.
Yeah, and they could have spent the Dragon's interim, building new ships, for example. If they knew, they should have known they'd need them. But that's the thing, I think Aegon was overconfident. Navies are almost always a massive, massive part of any sort of combat, any sort of campaign. Even if we're talking ancient warfare, even if we're talking pre-medieval, supplying or just that being a part of a campaign is super important. And I think Aegon got overconfident. It wasn't a big part of his campaign because he had dragons. He had something that the real world doesn't exist and they never had to deal with or include in their plans. So I think there's a blind spot in his preparations and his outlook, partly because of two things. One, he didn't need them. And now he does, and didn't realize it till maybe it was too late, if he ever realized it. He may never have figured out what his mistake was, or that particular mistake, since, as you say, Sean, there were several mistakes. And who knows? Aegon being kind of a impenetrable personality, we don't know a lot about him. We don't know. We're never going to know exactly what he felt, except for frustration. He certainly was upset that he failed. That's for sure. But if he aimed his frustration at certain things, who knows? That's not clear.
There's a few other factors we'll touch on here too, but he easily could have been misled. His overconfidence might have come from those southern troops who were just raring to get those Dornish.
Yeah, they have
And those guys might have also, even if they had a proper respect for Dorne and even the desert and the past and everything else, this is the first time they would have been moving down in full force with an alliance from other people. They're not like bringing this big force to attack Dorne and worried someone's going to attack them from behind while they're out. Does that make sense? That it's the first time that the people that would have attacked them from behind are with them to go down to Dorne, and they also have the dragon's firepower. There's all these reasons. Hindsight's 2020, right? I could see at the get-go why they might have felt confident about this. But
also, here's a great point that Nina made, that Dorne was never truly united until an outside power came in the first place. It was Nymeria in the first place who united Dorne. They were always sort of disparate and relatively independent amongst themselves in a way that wasn't so true, or perhaps is less true, in the rest of Westeros. And maybe that's what they were looking at. They were like, well, it took an outsider to come in and bring them together. It's going to take an outsider to do that again. So they may have looked to that notion as a positive. It probably wasn't true, because they are united now. That unity still exists. They're still united after Nymeria, even though they do often fight with each other. They underestimate from the outside how much that squabbling amongst themselves can fall off completely when they're faced with an outsider, someone they hate even more. Yeah, they hate each other, but they hate outsiders even more. I think that's something that maybe they didn't catch. Dorne also wasn't some extremely powerful nation. They're not an economic powerhouse. They don't have a lot of cities. There's really just the Planky Town, which is maybe not quite a city. There's a decent population there, but it's different. It's not a big political power. They don't wield a lot of power outside their own region. They certainly wield some. We saw them get involved in wars and maybe tilt the scales one way or another when Westeros was dealing with the Stepstones, or fighting against the Kingdom of the Three Daughters, or any of that stuff. Dorne was like a wild card that could impact those scenarios, but they were never the deciding factor. Dorne was like, oh no, Dorne joined this side. That side's clearly going to win. They were never that big. What makes them special is their internal workings, not how they affect the rest of the world, I suppose you could say. So by promising trade deals or other things like that, it's not as interesting to them. It doesn't get them as much. If you tell the people of Lys or of Volantis that you have an exclusive trade deal with Westeros, that's huge. But to Dorne, they don't do as much trade in the first place. It doesn't matter as much.
They're not as interconnected with each other, with the rest of the realm, with the rest of the world, which, pros and cons, it means it's harder for them to be as valuable as an ally, but it's also harder to conquer them, right?
Yeah. I wonder, too, I don't think it's mentioned how much raiding was happening. We always know that throughout the centuries, throughout the eons, raids occurred back and forth between Stormlands, Reach, and Dorne, vice versa, back and forth, etc. Was that still happening in the early days after the conquest? If so, it might put a little more emphasis on Aegon getting this done. He's like, look, there's this constant state of micro warfare happening here. This is not the king's peace. You need to do something about this. And, the obvious solution from a conqueror's perspective is just take the whole thing. And then you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can make it an internal issue, and etc. It's no longer a foreign enemy attacking your kingdom. It's unrest within your kingdom, which makes you look better, I guess, when you're king. It's weaker when you have outsiders attacking you and you're not doing anything about it, even if they're just raiders and they're not any political threat. Still, someone like Aegon, who's trying to show how strong he is and act through pure domination and always taking the challenge head on, winning to show how strong he is, this would bother him, perhaps, or maybe eke away at a little bit of his mystique. And I think he thought that was important. So, but peace is valuable. Now, peace is a valuable thing on either side, right? That's something Dorne would say, well, yeah, okay, well, maybe that's a thing. We don't care as much about the trade or the prestige or whatever. But peace, that's worth something. I'm not sure that Miria was someone who cared about it as much as maybe some of her descendants will.
I even think that she would care about it, but she doesn't care about it as much as she cares about her independence or her legacy or all these other factors. And, that's like through history, especially in modern times, that's a common conflict between security, peace, and independence, freedom. Those are often in conflict.
And Nina points out, too, Aegon may not have wanted to look like just a greedy conqueror. Like, I take everything. He might have taken some time and done the negotiating route. Perhaps not even thinking it would work, but just for optics. It's like, well, we can't just go attack everyone. We should at least try to handle things diplomatically first. And showing that he has that gear, even if in his mind he's like, oh, we're probably just gonna. That way he can maybe make them look like the bad guy. He can sort of say, hey, look, we tried to find a peaceable solution. It just didn't work. It's like, no one's going to make the argument, well, why not just do nothing? Why not just leave them alone? It's like, well, that's politics, right? He's saying he's creating his own argument. But he's both creating the argument and answering it all at once while ignoring some of the other issues here. That's the people. That's like the whole history is written by the winners statement. There, like he gets to decide how this is framed because he's the one with the voice.
It is true though, given that he's going to attack them, given that it is his mission to unite Westeros. It didn't pan out this way, but he probably hoped that by offering peace first, he would maybe not look like the good guy, but more the good guy. And that maybe he wouldn't even need as much war if like the people of Dorne in general were like, yeah, we want peace. We don't want this fight. That's Myria. That's Sunspear. We're all happy to be part of Westeros. Sure, we're not going to fight back. If they understand he's offering peace, but it's the leaders that are fighting. Once again, a parallel to Vietnam, like the people in America, like, why are we even doing this?
It's like, see, these Vietnamese just refuse to make peace. It's like, yo, you attacked them in the first place, but people will forget. Yeah, people will forget that, or they will accept the framing without questioning it.
Right. And there even then, it wasn't that simple too. Like there was a bigger picture, right? That we're worried about Soviets taking over the world and they got a foothold in Vietnam. So we got to do something about that. Aegon feels like we have to unite Westeros. There's however justified these reasons are, that was what was underlying. So, but the thing is, and it did eventually, the people of America were fed up and just, political pressure became too much and we got out of there. It was like a mar. It was like a loss, it was like a what do you call it? An embarrassment, a defeat, things America's not used to. Right. And, but it didn't happen. It's like the other way around here. Like eventually Aegon does stop, right? Cause they're so bogged down. The people of Vietnam weren't saying like, oh, since he offered peace, we'll go along with that and turn on our leaders. They didn't turn on our leaders.
Yeah. They didn't. You're right. It was more medieval. It was like, we're on our team. We stay on our team. We don't care. We don't have considerations like human rights and the basic considerations for the sanctity of life that we hope to have here in 2024 that they definitely don't have there.
A little bit of a tangent, but I wonder how it would have been different. Because that one different thing about Vietnam was it was on TV. Everyone was seeing all this violence and destruction and the loss of innocent lives. I wonder if the people of Dorne, because they're not as connected with each other, they might not have realized how widespread the tragedy and loss was. I wonder if it would have changed anything if they did know better.
That's a great point that we're going to get to, because it's also going to come up for Aegon and his armies. And it's like, well, what didn't we have a third army? What happened to that army?
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're not talking about them anymore. That's kind of ominous. You're like, weren't there some Stormlanders? Didn't they have an army like around here with us? And like, what happened to them? Well, yeah, they're gone. That's going to happen. So that's we'll get to that later. So another aspect of this is Aegon had already started calling himself King of the Rhoynar. That title that Robert has, that we see the titles, the King of the Rhoynar. That wasn't like added when Dorne finally came to the realm. The Targaryen kings were saying that from the beginning, like starting with Aegon and all the way through until it was actually true. It was not true for, 190-ish years. But they said it anyway. It was probably the Dornish probably like shaking their heads like, no, you're not. You are absolutely not.
I think Does that mean that technically it's been untrue for more of the Targaryen reign than it's
Yeah.
been true?
Good point.
Because,
Yeah.
like, it's not like Dany isn't really, like, she calls herself that, but she's not there either. So, like, I don't know.
Yeah, it was only true for about 100 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
not true for about almost 200. So yeah. That's really funny. Now it gets funnier though in the real world. As silly as that is, the real world is way worse. Like it often is. At the heart of the 100 Years' War, which of course was England and France going at it multiple different times. Of course, obviously it didn't start and end with the same people involved when it's 100 years here. There was the English Plantagenet King Edward III, who was grandson of King Philip IV of France. They kept, starting at 1340, the kings of England added King of France to their title and kept doing that until the year 1800.
Napoleon finally scared him off.
Yeah, Napoleon, you're like, oh, okay, never mind.
Oh, that was before Napoleon, I guess.
It was. He came, it was like another 40, 50 years, yeah. But still, they saw him coming. They felt it coming. They're like, something is coming. They had their own little prophecy of snow and ice and...
In Russia.
And Russia, yeah. And they thought of vanilla and chocolate and strawberry coming right at them. Oh, that's Neapolitan. That's not Napoleon, right?
Close.
Yeah, very close. Very close.
Okay, that would
so
be a nice substitution to make if you could go back in time.
yeah, instead of invading Russia, you should have had ice cream. That's better. That's much better. Okay, so let's go into this next section. First blood and fire. This is how it begins. Quote.
The start of the First Dornish War is generally fixed at 4 AC, when Rhaenys Targaryen returned to Dorne. This time she came with fire and blood, just as she had threatened. Riding Meraxes, the queen descended out of a clear blue sky and set the Planky Town ablaze, the fires leaping from boat to boat until the whole mouth of the Greenblood was choked with burning flotsam, and the pillar of smoke could be seen as far away as Sunspear. The denizens of the floating town took to the river for refuge from the flames, so fewer than 100 died in the attack, and most of those from drowning rather than dragonfire. But first blood had been shed.
It had indeed. So remember that Planky Town is basically a boat city. The entire thing is a bunch of boats lashed together. Shops, homes, everything floats on the river as part of it. I've seen this. I've not obviously at the Planky Town, but I've seen something like this in Cambodia. Just large platforms all lashed together, multiple boats, and then other platforms and edifices attached to that. It's pretty amazing, actually. And not so it wasn't to this extreme, but I have seen something like that in the real world. Now, boats are extremely vulnerable to dragons. Anything wooden is, and this isn't moving like a lot of boats. And even moving boats are extremely vulnerable to dragons because, they're not that fast compared to a flying dragon. And especially in this era, you see very few anti-dragon type weaponry. There's going to be more of it because, well, people need it. But for a while there, before the Targaryen conquest, between the Century of Blood and the fall of Valyria, there was a time where the world may have maybe not forgotten about the threat of dragons, but it wasn't a problem. Like there weren't dragons coming to attack your cities, or it wasn't a concern. So items like scorpions and these larger bolt throwers might have there was less demand for them, and thus there would be fewer people who knew how to make them, and etc. Now that's obviously going to change, but certainly Dorne wasn't prepared at this point by any means for such a thing. Maybe they should have been. Arguably they should have been. They probably knew that something like this was going to happen. Or maybe they should have known that something like this was going to happen. After all, she promised to return. The Targaryens had obviously shown that they were more than willing to... The Targaryens had obviously shown they were more than willing to do this sort of thing, to just attack, basically unprovoked. And so, yeah. And it would have, had they sat down to think about where the Targaryens would attack, well, the Planky Town is at the mouth of the Greenblood. It's a very kind of obvious target, right? It's if you look at the map, you can see where it is. So one of the reasons it's obvious is because it's so vulnerable. All the ships, all the people, and because Rhaenys could probably attack it without being spotted from very far away in the first place. She said she comes out of a clear blue sky, but she could have been flying over the ocean where it would have been harder to see her from a distance. until it was pretty close, until she's right there. And, she probably made some people nervous. They're like, wait, is that a dragon? What is that? From a distance. And then as she gets closer and closer and you realize that she's moving fast and she's not veering away. And why would she be coming towards Planky Town for any reason other than to attack would be like the sinking feeling that some few might have. And then panic might start to spread. And then that first blast of flame happens and then it's on. And then people are jumping in the water right away. There's no reason to stick around and wait. And that's why the casualties were relatively low, I guess, is because while she's torching all these things, everyone else on the entire platform is jumping off, so they actually would have had a decent amount of time. Not that it makes their lives much easier afterwards, but they did have an opportunity to jump off.
Oh, Sean, you're muted. Sean, you are muted. Please say that, Aziz. I'm muted.
You're muted, Sean.
Got it. A couple other factors are, I think it's possible, if not likely, that a large portion had already been evacuated. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to think that they had an idea that something was coming, right? That not only in general, they know the threat has been put out there, but the mobilization of all these forces, that would have been noticed.
That's a good point. Okay.
Yeah, even without a particular spy network, I think scouts would have just observed it. They're just, when you mobilize 30,000 humans, that's going to have effect in surrounding communities. Word's going to spread. But if you do have scouts and spies in place, you would definitely know. And Planky Town would have been a prime target, right? Like every city, quote unquote city, every castle, village, whatever, might have been on high alert, right? The word might have been sent out. And Planky Town, which would be particularly vulnerable to dragonfire and a big population, it was all the reasons they went there are the reasons Myria would know it's a place they might go, right? So I think there's a decent chance that there might have been some sort of plan in place already
or at least to put them on warning.
Out.
Yeah, at least let people know, because it's a long time. They never know when exactly it's going to come. But that's a great point about the mobilization of the troops, and they had to know something was coming. You don't and 30,000 is the right number. That's how many Reachmen mobilized, and that's just the fighting men. There's obviously other people in the army that are supporting it, and supplies getting together, all that other stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. You can't hide
even
that.
If all the military leaders were lips tight, secretly organizing 30,000 troops, just the people in town are just going to notice it's happening. All the wives and farmers, all the food being gathered. It's just, that's a huge commotion to not get noticed, to not have word spreads.
It also just doesn't really go with Aegon's vibe. He is I attack you head on and I'm coming. And that way there's no doubt as to who's stronger, because I didn't trick you. I wasn't clever. We took our best. It was strength versus strength and I came out ahead. That's how he likes to present his victories, I think. So sneaking up and, we won because of the element of surprise. That's not how he wants to be portrayed. He wants to be portrayed as, I won because I was stronger, period. And it's not hard to do when you have Balerion, but definitely he was disabused of some of what counts for strength and other people's willingness to just meet him head on like this. Well, what if we just don't meet you head on, Mr. Giant Dragon? It's like, oh, well, I don't know, actually. I guess I win. I mean, and he does seem a little confused by this strategy, even though to us it's kind of obvious. Well, yeah, of course you don't go fight the dragons head on. This seems like the obvious choice, whereas the folks in Westeros, the rest of Westeros made the silly choice. Anyway, it's pretty evil stuff though, right? Just going in and burning all these boats and all these people. And
it is, don't get me wrong, because I want to point out, even if only 100 people died there, first of all, only 100 people. I guess you can say that when it might have been thousands, but it's still awful for 100 people to die.
Yeah.
A. B. All the people who lived lost their homes and their businesses and their livelihood and everything else, even outside the context of the rest of Dorne burning its crops to keep the invading army from having anything to pillage. There's no way the rest of that population was just fine. Yeah. I guarantee you people starved to death. People who didn't immediately die of burns ended up dying of burns. All the other problems that would come with an entire town being burned down. It's not as simple as only 100 people died. I just can't imagine the drama, the anguish and everything that the rest of that population had to go through in the coming days and weeks and even years to try to rebuild from that. Every one of those 100 people had a mom, a cousin, like all the families are upset.
Yeah.
So it's awful. Yeah.
It is really, yeah.
But I do wonder, another thing I wonder is if, especially because it doesn't seem like we're at revenge mode yet. And so far, Aegon has just been trying to take out military targets and win quick, easy victories without a lot of losses. He wants to rule the land, not destroy it, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if the dragons circled around a couple times, maybe a couple strafes at a key spot, right, to block off the waterway. Time might have been given for people to escape, is what I'm saying.
She was letting people get away. She's
right.
Okay. Yeah, maybe. That's entirely possible. Yeah, you got to throw that out there as a possibility, or it could be a lie. It could be a lot. Maybe a lot more than 100 people died, and that's just what was recorded. I don't see the point of that.
Didn't want the numbers to get out.
I don't see the point of that, given how many people died and how vicious this war got. It's like, oh, but it makes it look a little bit nicer now. That's like one raindrop in a storm because of how vicious this whole thing was. So, but it was at the beginning, so maybe. But yeah, this was an attack, like you say, Sean. This wasn't a military target. This was an attack on people. This is like just burning a bunch of villages, important villages, like crucial villages, food supplying villages. And one of the great things about A Song of Ice and Fire is the prose is so strong. There's so many great quotes, so many lines that stick with you in the real world that you can refer to as touchstones. And one of them is here. You were just referring to, what do you have left when everything you have is destroyed? All you have left is your life. Mirri Maz Duur has a quote on that. Look to your call, she says, and see what life is worth when all the rest is gone. Like when everything you love, every person you love, all the things you knew, like what good is life at that point? You may as well be dead. Like your life is maybe not even worth living at that point. And that's the point she's making. And that's the kind of the point you're making here. Now it's not quite as bad. These people didn't lose all their own people. There's still a lot of Dornish left. And there's still people they would, like you said, they probably still have cousins and mothers. It's not quite as overwhelming as what happened to Mirri Maz Duur. Her entire world was in that village. But the point is it's very similar. And the destruction was strong. No matter whether Rhaenys gave them a little time or whether she just went full bore right away, it turned into a full-blown conflagration. There was choking of the ships, burning in the outcrop of the harbor there. It was like a dam, basically. Picture the Battle of the Blackwater. Right? The ships choked in the harbor there. It's very similar, just dragon fire instead of wildfire. There would even be non-normal looking flames because Meraxes would be shooting silver flames from her maw, I would assume. She's silver, and that's usually how it works, right? So you would even have that going. You would even have the odd colored flames mixed with the normal colored flames. So a lot of Battle of Blackwater vibes there. And this is when it gets kind of horrific from a historical perspective. There's at least two things that come up here that would be in the minds of a lot of Rhoynish people, especially the Dornish people with Rhoynish blood, I should say, but just any Dornish person. Because for one thing, it was Nymeria's burning of the ships that symbolized the end of their journey. She said, okay, we've made it to Dorne after all of our long wanderings, our odyssey, basically, and this is where we're staying. And to symbolize that and to truly invest in our new home, we're going to destroy our ships. We're going to burn all our ships. It's a famous moment. It's portrayed on our maps. And it's just a great scene from Westeros history. And here it is kind of turned around on them. Like, yeah, now you're stuck here. All your ships, we burned them. And it's that whole, it's your new home is being turned against them. It's being inverted. And the other memory would be, of course, farther back, the beginning of Nymeria's journey, when all their cities were burned by dragons, when they had to leave in the first place. And now here they go hacking again. They're all living on a river, and these dragons come and burn all their river cities and drive them away in their ships, and they flee. And so this is a lot of like historical trauma that's being raised by this attack, especially considering it's descendants of those same people. You have the descendants of the Valyrians inflicting a similar level of devastation and unjust warfare on the descendants of the Rhoynar. It's pretty heavy. So yeah, so and there'd be nothing they could do. In the longer term, like I pointed out, yeah, they might get a hold of some scorpions, some bolt throwers, some extra bows here and there. But here, early on, they may not have had much waiting, even with the notion that there might have been something coming, even with the idea that they should be prepared. They clearly didn't have a whole lot. So, yeah, it's pretty heavy. Now, one other, speaking of Dany and Mary Mazdur, yet another parallel comes to mind here, which is that Dany has the vision of the crones of the Dosh Kalin bowing before her while dripping wet, which makes me think of this. Is because I feel like they jump into the water, the womb of the world, to maybe escape Dany's conflagration that she brings on them, which might be happening in the Winds of Winter. That vision will have to get fulfilled somehow, and the only reason I could ever perceive of them being wet was because they were underwater, or they jumped into the water potentially because of fire.
Well, you haven't fantasized about the ladies of the Dosh Kalin enough.
Kind of different kind of wet, huh?
Yeah.
Yikes.
They could have been trapped in the rain.
Yeah, that's
the rain, yeah, because we all know
meant.
rainfall is very,
we're a PG show.
very
Go
common
on.
in the Dothraki Sea, yeah. So, Rhaenys didn't come alone this time, though. She didn't just come with a dragon and start burning the Planky Town. Well, she
didn't come alone this time. She come with Aegon? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm done.
Your mind's in the... Yeah. So, she was sort of by herself, but because she's the only one attacking the Planky Town. But there were two other invasion forces that came simultaneously. You just can't get away from this now. Anyway, quote...
Elsewhere, Orys Baratheon led 1,000 picked knights up the Bone Way, whilst Aegon himself marched through the Prince's Pass at the head of an army 30,000 strong, led by near 2,000 mounted knights and 300 lords and bannermen. Lord Harlan Tyrell, the Warden of the South, was heard to say that they had more than enough power to smash any Dornish army that tried to stand before them, even without Aegon and Balerion. No doubt he had the right of that, but the issue was never proved, for the Dornishmen never offered battle. Instead, they withdrew before King Aegon's host, burning their crops in the field and poisoning every well.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting strategy, too. I love that point of this guy. It just goes to show how unprepared, how naive they were. Any army that tries to stand before us will smash. Well, none of them tried to stand before you. Just simple as that. It really just is that simple. Like, well, we're just not going to stand before you. We're just not going to face you. Like, why would we? So the vast majority, though, it says it's a very uneven pair of of invasion forces. You've got 30,000 going through the Prince's Pass and 1,000 through the Bone Way. It kind of makes sense in a way because the Bone Way is a lot harder. It's a lot nastier, a lot stonier. It's called the Stone Way. The Bone Way is the nickname because of how deadly it is. But it's still not a good idea. Less men, more men. It's still a bad idea. It's still really difficult. And there were, apart from what's being described here with the burning of the crops and the fields and the poisoning of the wells, there was also night attacks, raids, rocks being rolled down from the heights, things like that. All sorts of little things that would really add up. And maybe they don't kill that many people, but they really, really impact the morale of the army. You're up, you're in your tent, you're just like worried about that. You got anxiety about where the next attack is going to come from. And you might have gone in confident. You might have been like, yeah, we're all marching. Look at how big our army is. Our leaders are really confident. That confidence will trickle down to you. Maybe you're already confident anyway. But as time passes, with every poisoned well, every burned field, every day that passes without any sort of real progress, and you're just marching around and the Dornish aren't fighting you, your confidence is going to start to ebb away. Like, this is the thing I said at the beginning about putting yourself in their place and thinking about how this is going. You start off feeling great about it, but then there's some cracks in your confidence. And then it starts to like full-blown fall apart because it's hard to be confident when you're not confident, and then throw in hunger. Like, think about how hard it is to just do anything properly when you're hungry. I mean, I'm a great example of that. I get pretty hangry. I would be hopeless in this scenario. And some people wouldn't have been confident going in. Some of them would have been frightened from the get-go. And this would just make them like pure panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and then it would snowball, to use a metaphor that is entirely inappropriate for Dorne. Snowball. But the hunger, the anxiety, the lack of sleep, all these things would build. Like they'd get worse and worse. Your anxiety would grow. Your lack of sleep would fuel the anxiety, your panic, your inability. And then you're just not a very good soldier, right? If you ever were in the first place.
Keep in mind some of these things, you would have the common soldiers, if you will. But the leaders, they would go through this too. They would also suddenly have extra anxiety and fear and be losing sleep. You'd have to set up new guards systems, new like night watches or whatever. Just all they have to do is attack one time in the middle of the night and kill one person. Now 10 people are not getting sleep every night now because they have to pull guard duty to prevent against that. And kind of like how I said before for the those 100 killed at Planky Town, each one of them would have had a family, a friend, a lot more there was more loss than just each of those person's lives. It was what they were contributing to the community and their family and everything. Well, when one soldier dies, they've got a buddy, they've got a teammate, a sergeant, a subordinate. They have, friends. They have a responsibility. They were supposed to pull guard duty tomorrow night or sharpen a sword to feed the horde. Whatever they were doing, now someone else has to do it. So plus the heat, on. It's
there's so many factors. We can't even name them all. And that's a really good point, Sean, about the way the duties will have to be done, even as you become less capable of doing them, whether or not men have been lost or not, which they probably have. Like just anyone who's like ever worked a shift at a restaurant or a store when you're understaffed, just picture that, but and imagine it being a life and death situation instead. It's awful. The non-life and death version of this, but the life and death version of it is kind of, unless you've been in it, it's probably pretty much unfathomable. And this style of warfare is familiar to us. We've all heard of guerrilla warfare before. We've talked about it before. You've probably talked about it or heard about it on other shows or elsewhere in your life. But the Dornish especially, we even associate this with them. And we have been doing that ever since early in A Song of Ice and Fire. Even before these histories were explored, you kind of got the vibe that was what Dorne was about. That's their style of warfare. We've seen it just based on parallels to the real world. It's kind of what you expected. But the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, they saw the way that everybody fought Aegon and expected it to be the same. And it just wasn't. And yeah, Dorne worships the same gods as the rest of Westeros. So they have knights, lords, and ladies. So, to be fair, there was a lot of things in place that would make it seem like they might do things similarly. But there was so much that showed it how wrong they were. Because even if you say, okay, Aegon and Rhaenys and Visenya's not here, but even her advice would have been part of the campaign planning strategy. Okay, so they're not used to guerrilla campaigns. Maybe they didn't expect that. But their allies did. Their allies should have. The Reachmen, the Stormlanders, where was their advice? Where was their... Maybe Aegon didn't listen to them? Or many of the veterans of the Stormlands died fighting alongside Argilac the Arrogant. That was a very bloody campaign amidst the whole conquest, which we talked about with Jim McGeehan in our Battle of the Stormlands, that Battle of Last Storm, rather. And so maybe a lot of that wisdom that would have been, because it's really the Stormlands that fought even more. They had the really vicious relationship, Argilac and Myria. So maybe his veterans would have been the ones that had the most to say that Aegon might have listened to, but they just weren't. They weren't there. They were dead. They died next to Meraxes and Orys and Argilac, and not next to the first two who lived, and Orys who didn't. So,
once they did live, what might have outweighed their potential wisdom might have been a quest for revenge or a bolstered confidence, since they had allies going with them. So
that's true, and so many men lost in the field of fire as well. So like this, maybe some smarter Reachmen, those who might have known better, might have died. So, yeah. Now, there was some experience Targaryens had with this. Like, remember Harren the Black Sons did a surprise attack at the Battle of the Wailing Widows and all that. But it wasn't anything like this. And those were maybe like one-offs. This is like a constant thing. Like, every night they feared night attacks. I don't get the impression that Aegon's campaign was worried about that in their march through the Riverlands. It was like, oh, they got us this one time, but that's very unlikely to happen again. They, like, for one thing, Aegon's chased after them and burned them. So it's like, well, it certainly won't be the same group doing that, and Harren's sons were amongst them. So, like, yeah, the opportunity just wasn't there. It's not Dorne. They don't have mountains to hide in. They don't have rocks to roll down on you when you're in the Riverlands. You know, the terrain is just totally different ballgame. And of course, it's smarter. We've said this over and over. We probably will. It's yes, this is clearly a better way to fight dragons. Hiding in caves means the dragons can't scout you out and see you from a distance, which was also a factor in the Stormlands with the trees, which is why they burned all the trees. That comes back to our Vietnam example and the napalm and all that. So are the Dornish being smart? I'd say yes, to a certain extent, but I think a bigger aspect is just the Targaryens and the allies are being dumb. And the Dornish are just like, yeah, let them be dumb. Let's allow them their dumbness to ruin them, and we'll just play around that. So, yeah, I don't think it was an advanced strategy by then. I don't think the Dornish were doing something they hadn't done before. This wasn't some new adaptive strategy. It was just used against an enemy that they hadn't faced before, or at least since the days of Valyria, but not in Dorne. What do you think about that, Sean? Would you say it's more about the Targaryens being naive, or semantics, maybe?
A little of both. I want to point out one thing that might be different about this is that Dorne is doing it as a nation instead of, like, you know, towns on the borders where these skirmishes happen sometimes, right? It's different for all of Dorne to be doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I do think that, so, you know, maybe that's a difference, if you will. Maybe Dorne ramped up just the coordination to have these different towns be emptied out takes a level that wouldn't have been there just because, like, you know, some marcher army, some conflict up in some mountain passes, that doesn't make the people in Planky Town do anything differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So Dorne doing it as a whole might be something that's new or underestimated, and also, you know, I think that it does seem like Aegon's forces are making some mistakes, but I still think that it would have been hard to really see how all this was going to go, right? Even if they had tried to amend some of these mistakes. Like I said, like, say they had loaded up boats with supplies and the boats are waiting there on the northern coast of Dorne. Like, oh, it wouldn't have mattered. They never got there anyway. And there's a lot of mistakes they might have accounted for, and it wouldn't have been enough to really stop the all-out effort that Dorne was going through. Or I can even imagine some people, just like in Dorne, despite all the losses, Dorne, as bad as it is for this force coming down, it's especially right here in the beginning, I think the overall losses for Dorne were probably greater. But it never made Dorne want to back down. Right. I don't think all these troops that have been in conflict with Dorne forever are like, oh, well, they beat us in one battle, or we might lose some soldiers. They might get us with the guerrilla tactics. I guess we shouldn't do it. Like, they are just like in real world, when people have grudges, when there's generations long, you know, conflicts have been going on, people make mistakes. They just charge in with this foolhardy braveness just because they want revenge, you know?
Yeah, hate is a really powerful drug, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is. So, and there's some other considerations too. We try really hard to put ourselves in their minds, both sides of this and all minds in between, the people who were in control or just following along. And it's sometimes you can't do that, but we try to do our best. And I think that if you try to have, like, the mindset of Aegon, who's ultra confident, ultra, like, macho almost, would be to use a modern term, he's not going to look at this as something he can back down on. Nymeria united Dorne, and she didn't have dragons. She didn't have a big army. She had refugees, right? She had way less than Aegon was, and she did this. How's Aegon going to look at that and be like, well, if she can do it, I can do it. And I should be able to do it easier because I have a lot more than she did, right? From his perspective, from what he thinks power derives from where he thinks strength comes from, the way he approaches these problems is very different than how Nymeria did. Nymeria played people off each other. She used alliances a lot. She didn't have these obviously overwhelming powers to use. So she had to use more cleverness and things like that. Not that Aegon wasn't clever, it's just he didn't have to be clever, and when we don't use your clever muscles, they atrophy, right? So that also means he's not as clever in deciphering his opponent's cleverness and predicting cleverness. He expects them to be a little more like him and face him head on, and just, this is how we prove who the strongest is. It's me. But so he's got to be like, this woman did this, but I can't do it. Like, that's crazy to him, you know. And it's crazy to a lot of Westerosi because they're also very much drinking that same Kool-Aid of there's definitely a woman can't conquer something that a man can't conquer. Like, that's crazy to them, right? That doesn't make any sense in their worldview, especially when there's also women on their side with dragons. So, like, they've got both of that things covered. They've got all that covered. So they just can't understand. They can't conceive losing here. They've got the bigger army. They've got the unbroken advantage of dragons. They've got so much. They just, even though we can look at it and say, yeah, that there's also so many problems, but they just don't see those problems as being able to overcome their advantages. So who knows how long it had been since there had been a full-on war against Dorne. You know, we've heard that Argilac had turned back a Dornish invasion early in his reign, which is pretty interesting. And given how long Miria has been alive, I mean, she's not going to die till her 90s. And she was probably the one that launched that invasion, or was at least her father or mother did. And so she's got a lot of experience with this. She may have some experience in ways of warfare between the kingdoms that we aren't able to suss out, and things that even Aegon and his counselors wouldn't have been aware of. So that's pretty big deal too. Her long-term wisdom and experience is something that we should assume played a big role, even if we can't be detailed about how it manifested as a strategy. But maybe this whole avoidance strategy was just her plan from the beginning. It was like, well, this is how we're going to do it. I mean, they must have been confused that no one met them in the passes. Like, this is a good place to fight. Like, if you're going to stop an army from entering your territory, it's in this narrow area where they can't spread out and get around you. Like, their 30,000 men can't envelop you. But they chose not to even fight them in the passes where numbers wouldn't tell, which might have given more overconfidence to the invaders. Like, look, they won't even face us. They won't even take their best defensive positions when they're given to them. They won't even use that. So they must be afraid. They would tell themselves that, right? They're afraid. That's what this mindset is. If you're the type of people that you always decide things on pitched battle, and someone won't have a pitched battle with you, you tell themselves you tell yourself they're afraid. We saw that. We've seen that a few times in A Song of Ice and Fire as well.
By the way, they were afraid, but that doesn't mean that they gave up.
Right. Very important distinction. True.
A lot of times you make some great decisions out of fear, right?
Yeah. Like, why would you? Again, it's being afraid of something doesn't mean you're a coward or that you shouldn't be afraid of it. Yeah, I'm afraid of dragons. If they were real, I'd be afraid of that. It doesn't make me lesser. It makes me like sensible. It makes like normal.
Yeah.
Like, yes, you should be afraid of something that can kill you with like 0% effort, you know, by accident. Just like it sneezes and you're dead, you know, like that's what we're dealing with here. If only the Targaryens had some sort of beverage or something that made them smarter, something that helped them think through things more thoroughly. Like
wine?
No, I don't think wine would help with that. Magic wine maybe would, but no, I'm talking about magic mind. I've one thing I've noticed in the difference between drinking it and not drinking it. Like we've had it around off and on long enough. We've got another shipment coming in shortly. I've been without it for a little while. I kind of noticed, like when we first had it and then I didn't have it. I've gone off and on with it a few times now that I can sort of tell that I need it again. I want, even if it's only a small boost in my focus, and who would ever measure something? Maybe it's a large boost in my focus. You know, you don't want to give that up. Once you have something that makes you function a little better, you want to keep that going.
Yeah, I mean, tell that to coffee drinkers. Yeah, it makes it it's not abnormal.
Wrong. It's both.
I just made an order of Magic Mind myself last night, by the way. I just ran out of what they had sent us, so.
It's like, yeah, like I was saying with coffee, yes, coffee is addictive, but the benefits are still there. Like, you want those benefits and it's addictive. So getting rid of the addictive part is good because you can still have those benefits. You can still get the boost, the focus, the clarity, but with less of the jitters and the, like, I gotta have this feeling, the
Sleep
borderline. Yeah, that too. The sleep disruption, the borderline addictiveness, if not full-blown addictiveness. So that's pretty valuable, I think.
I think it's tastier too, but that's also a very much your mileage may vary.
Yeah, that's very true. Taste really does vary. But that's one thing I like about Magic Mind too, is it mixes really well. You can have it straight. Sean often says he has it straight, but you've mixed it with in your concoctions as well. And I've done the same thing. Have it over ice, have it as a shot, mix it in with other juices, just have it with water, just dilute it, that's fine too. Which is cool too. Like, just like coffee, you've got a bajillion ways to drink it. And Magic Mind, same thing. Only this January, they help you gear up to crush your 2024 New Year's resolutions fully focused. It's a good time for that. If you're making changes in your life in January, it's a good time for that. Everybody's thinking about it, so why not get on that groupthink bandwagon? When it's something positive, do that. Like, I'm not a groupthink guy, but sometimes we all do the same thing because it's smart, because it makes sense. It's good. I think New Year's resolutions are one of those things where, you can get a little too far with it. You can get a little too gung-ho. I've spoken about this before. Set yourself a target. Don't set a goal, because goals, if you don't reach it, you can be disappointed. But if you get a target, is like a general idea. And if you do pretty well, you can still pump yourself up a little and keep your motivation going and not go, I could not keep that going. I suck. Give yourself a softer landing, and Magic Mind can help with that. You get 1 month for free when you're subscribing for 3 months at magicmind.com/Jan Westeros. That's Jan, like the month, Westeros. And if you add in the code Westeros20, you can get up to 75% off total, because the Westeros 20 will get you 20% more off. It's only going to last till the end of January. So hurry up before it goes away. That's magicmind.com/Jan Westeros. Let's get into the ground invasion. We've talked about the first airstrike on Planky Town, but we discussed the troop dispositions, 30,000 men going south through the Prince's Pass, 1,000 picked knights heading through the Boneway. And here's what happened next. Quote,
"The invaders found the Dornish watchtowers in the Red Mountains slighted and abandoned. In the high passes, Aegon's vanguard found its way barred by a wall of sheep carcasses, shorn of all wool and too rotted to eat. The king's army was already running short of food and fodder by the time they emerged from the Prince's Pass to face the Dornish sands. There, Aegon divided his forces, sending Lord Tyrell south against Uthor Uller, Lord of the Hellholt, whilst he himself turned eastward to besiege Lord Fowler in his mountain fastness, Skyreach."
So yeah, as I said, the Prince's Pass is the western one, an easier route, though certainly not easy. And there is an army waiting in the Prince's Pass at the start of the Winds of Winter, and another in the Boneway. They have standing orders to either go into the Seven Kingdoms and attack or not. And it's an interesting sort of situation that's developing there. Now, again, I said this would be a great place to confront an invading army, and the reason they didn't was Balerion. Like, their defenses aren't what they normally would be with a big old black dragon just raining fire down on them. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work that way.
This would normally be a great place to confront an army.
Yeah.
But it's not a great place to confront an army and a dragon.
Yes. Good point. Good way to say it. Good said, Sean. Now, so Aegon split his army. Makes a lot of sense to do that because it's so hard to get food. And you have army splits up, it's going to different places to gather its food. Problem is, there's still so little food to gather. As it says, the army was already short of food and fodder just going through the pass. And this is just the beginning, right? So already the problems are beginning. And again, I don't know how the split was. It with a 50-50 split? Did Aegon take 15,000 guys and 15,000 went south? I don't know, but it was probably pretty close to even. He had Balerion with him, so maybe he gave them some more soldiers. On the other hand, Tyrell's going to go through the desert, so maybe he wants to have fewer men. I don't know. Either way, it wasn't smart. It didn't work out. This wall of sheep carcasses is really wild, right? Taunting them with wasted food. Like, look, we are not afraid of you. We're not going to run out of food. You're not going to get food locally because this is it. This is the local food all dumped in front of you rotting. This is what you have available to you. It's very ominous and very symbolic, and it's quite a statement. They're like, look, we don't need this. You're not going to find this. This is what's waiting for you, you know?
A couple of things. One is that would be a very difficult and disgusting barrier to try to get through, right?
Yeah, and to set up.
They probably would have preferred a bunch of rocks or something, right? Like that's like, think of the morale of the soldiers that had to deal with that, and maybe even sickness and disease that got spread from it. I don't know. But also, Nina points out this kind of feeds into what I was saying earlier. They couldn't have just done that last night, right?
Yeah, that's not one day.
Yeah, that's a lot of sheep. Think what it would take to physically get all the sheep there, to have them shorn, and be there long enough to rot. They had to have seen this invasion coming. This is some preparation time they had, right?
You're right. Yeah. Instead of sending their army there, they sent the wall of sheep. And this would be a lesson that Aegon's great-great-great-great-grandson Daeron I, the Young Dragon, learned very well. He used a goat track to bypass this sort of thing. Not necessarily walls of dead sheep, but scouts and mountain passes and watchtowers. Which, by the way, one of these watchtowers is probably the site of the Tower of Joy, because the Tower of Joy is in the Prince's Pass. Now, of course, Tower of Joy is just a nickname Rhaegar gave to one particular watchtower. It's wouldn't have any sort of defining features at this point if it even existed, but entirely possible. I mean, a watchtower is usually put in a place because of the terrain, and that wouldn't have changed after a couple hundred years, most likely. It might have, but probably not. So, very high likelihood that the tower had been there a long time, or one had been in its place if it had maybe fallen and been rebuilt or something.
Was that goat pass revealed by a Dornish trader by chance?
It might have been, but I don't think we know. It may have been,
it's just a strong
gathered.
300 parallel,
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, the Ephialtes, I think, was the name of that trader. By the way, highly recommend the book Gates of Fire, the movie 300, based on the graphic novel 300. It was originally going to be based on the book Gates of Fire, which is way, way better. It's historical fiction rather than, basically a comic book, which I have nothing against comic books, but they don't portray history very well. History is better for portraying history than graphic art, I think. So
it could get there. It can.
Yeah, like the two together, like read them both. Like they're both they're both very entertaining. But I think one is a lot more accurate. We'll say. So that's really wild to me. This whole sheep thing, and you're right to say that that's part of their strategy. The strategy of denial. Don't meet them in the field. Don't let the dragon destroy your armies. Make it hard for them in the other way. Make it gross. Make it nasty. Make it unpleasant. Make it stink. Make it hot. Take away the water. Take away the food. All the stuff that an army needs. Now, remember, they thought that they had planned around this. Remember, at the beginning of this episode, we talked about the weather and how, it'll be autumn heading into autumn. It's going to be getting, not only is it cooler now, but it's going to get cooler during the campaign because we're getting deeper and deeper into autumn and closer to winter. However, here's how that worked out for the Tyrell host. Quote,
"The Dornish sun proved unrelenting as Lord Tyrell marched toward Hellholt. In such heat, men drink more, and every waterhole and oasis in the army's path had been poisoned. Horses began to die, more every day, followed by their riders. The proud knights discarded their banners, their shields, their very armor. Lord Tyrell lost a quarter of his men and almost all his horses to the Dornish sands, and when at last he reached the Hellholt, he found it abandoned."
I think this is a part of the reason Dorne is so popular in the fandom, is stuff like this, where they're willing to ruin all their stuff to protect their people. Every little bit of item, of food, of water, all of it is just ammunition to save the humans.
I would say I agree with you. I think some people, maybe Sean perhaps, would argue against that and say, well, did it really protect their people in the long run? Did people die of starvation themselves? Like, did they hurt themselves by doing this? I don't know, but I do think some people probably would make that counterpoint that maybe that's what they consider their honor, their noble, but actually people are just gonna die from this.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
But maybe we're wrong, and maybe like no one died of starvation. No one like no family's livelihoods was ruined by them doing this. Like no sheep herder had a ruined life.
The sheep with Sean, like adding on to your idea, with Sean pointing out very accurately and likely that they planned the sheep thing for a while. How long have they been stashing food, knowing this might have been coming? Like they may have been preparing for winter. A dragon's winter rather than a different sort of preparation. So yeah, they've like we've given the listeners today many reasons to guess correctly. I think that they knew it was coming. You've pointed out there's several details here that show that. So this is an obvious way to prepare for if you're going to go hide in the caves. Put lots of food and water in the caves. If you're going to poison your wells, you better get a lot of water out of there first before that water is undrinkable for I don't know how many years.
Yeah, my other question is maybe they poisoned the wells knowing exactly what to do to neutralize it when they needed it to not be poisoned. It's not poisoned when they come back. They know that, you put this chemical in it and it does that. Or that they, again, knew that it would poison it for...
They did it before 5. And it was poisoned for 3 years, and so that's
there might be various things like that.
It's like I
think we should give them the benefit of the doubt that they knew what they were doing.
It can be pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, you can these like in Marine, they cut down the olive groves to keep food away from Dany's army, knowing that it would be 30 years before those trees could be replaced and growing olives again.
And whereas in that case, I think that was a bad choice.
That was that's different. Yeah,
so I don't give them the benefit of the doubt there, I guess, because I do think that
that food is
long.
that's 2 generations ish before that. Yeah, they need that. That's the rich slavers can get food elsewhere.
Yeah,
but it is a different consideration. You're right.
Some of this reminds me of our hardcore houses episode when I my attempt to define hardcore is that when things that would normally get in someone's way, if someone's determined to win, if you will, right? Whatever their mission is, that here, like you're going to win this war against Aegon, that, if you're, there's certain things that most people would be held back by, like super cold weather or hot weather or not eating human flesh or, something like that, right? Or not wanting to sacrifice your innocent population, not wanting to hamstring a whole generation by ruining all the crops for a year or two or poisoning well, things like that. That, all this stuff might make Dorne hardcore, and a lot of people might appreciate that. But there is this balance between peace and, prestige or legacy or independence or whatever it is Dorne thinks they're fighting for. And I think they went too far with it. It is even if they did plan ahead, and so they might have had some food reserves and stash extra water, but how much could it have been? There's still no way that they're not hamstringing the next year's population.
Which they would rather, they feel like that's the better sacrifice than sacrificing humans or independence. Same thing, Yeah.
I also want to point out, what did it take for the invading army to realize that the well was poisoned?
Oh, yeah. How many people?
With all these desperately thirsty people, and they start drinking the water, like... Do they drink it and keel over in 30 seconds and it warns everyone else not to do it? Or does it take a day or two to get diarrhea and slowly 4 days after you left the well, people are dropping dead?
Are they boiling the water?
Next well, and now you're still desperately thirsty and you do it again. Like, how many times did a bunch of people have to die or get terribly ill before they realize the wells are poisoned? Like, how could they even know it,
Well, what kind of poison are we talking about here? Are they just fouled, or is it like you say, is it something that you could boil out, or is it, or not? I don't know. Yeah.
Did they throw a dead sheep carcass down in there to put rotting bacteria and so they could see it immediately and know not to drink it? Or was it a hidden poison, or was it a deadly poison?
Probably all of the above, different wells, like they're not going to have some like standard supply of well poison that just everyone uses.
Yeah, just each town did whatever they could to poison their local wells. Yeah. Like Shea said, some of the smarter ones or advanced ones might have had a way to poison it and then an antidote for it. But my other thought here is just, again, how damaging it would be to morale for the horses to be dying. You got to understand a horse. I mean, maybe a bunch of like privileged noble lords don't really care about their horses, but I feel like a lot of them would. I feel like a horse has got to be cared for, it's as much as like a pet. Like, think how much food, it's an investment. Almost any angle you look at it, for your horse to die, you need it to ride, to carry your equipment. You've probably been with it a significant portion of your life. You've given it a lot of food and time and have a bond with it, and for it to die would be devastating on so many levels. And it's happening on a mass scale. I don't know. It just makes me sick to my stomach thinking about this whole scenario unfolding.
Even someone like Sandor Clegane, like a pretty mean, unsympathetic, guy. I mean, he's sympathetic in terms of the fandom, but like he doesn't have a lot of sympathy for others. Is what I mean. Yeah. Doesn't have a lot of attachments. He loves it. He loves his horse, Stranger. Or he may not. He wouldn't say it, but he really valued that horse. Maybe that's what he would say. Like, I got to get that horse back. He went back into the riot to get that horse. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Dunk was brought to tears losing his horse, and this is just a memory of his. We don't see it.
Dorne, right?
In Dorne, and he kind of remembers some of the Dornishmen were sort of like confused or even laughing at him for losing his horse, but they were.
You can't afford to waste tears in Dorne. You can't afford to waste water on crying.
Yeah. So without lifting a finger, Dorne itself. I mean, you could say they lift a finger, lifting dead sheep carcasses, but without fighting anyone, without meeting this Tyrell army. Some 15-ish thousand men marched to the Hellholt, and a quarter of them died, and who knows how many horses. That's like 4,000 men dying on this march. There's no way they saw that coming. They would not have just advanced into that if they knew it was going to be that bad. If you've seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, there's a scene kind of like this where a Crusader army is just heading out into the desert to chase Saladin. And Orlando Bloom's character and several people he's with are just like, you guys, this is so dumb. Don't go chasing a experienced desert general in the desert. Like, that's insanity. And one of the guys is like, who's a knight, who's always like, well, yeah, it doesn't seem the brightest idea, but I'm not going to disobey the king. Of course I'm going to follow the king into battle. Like, what other choices there? Like, it would be worse to disobey the king. Like, somehow this disloyalty would be worse than not walking into certain death. Like, wait a minute, what is this mindset? But that's how it is. Like, that's what really happened. I mean, they were portraying something that really happened basically in real history. These guys were overconfident. They're proud. They think God is with them, which I don't know how much that part of things was in play here. The whole faith aspect for the Westerosi. They might have been praying to the seven gods, but they would know that this isn't a religious opponent. They know that their enemies are also worshiping the same gods. So it's not like they can't necessarily expect the seven to be on their side over the Dornish. Some of them probably did. But it's not as clear cut as there's two very different religions at work here. Anyway, Saladin did the same thing. He used the desert to great advantage. Didn't let them fight head-on-head battles. Just let them starve and thirst to death, and that's much easier. So the green blood, seizing of the green blood is really important. That's the river, of course, by having Rhaenys cause great devastation there. Maybe Daeron the Young Dragon took that lesson amongst many of the things that didn't go well during this initial Targaryen invasion when he did his, 150 years later. He somewhat learned from his ancestors' mistakes. Some of them maybe he didn't learn, but he did learn some of these other things, and he had a lot more preparation for the heat and the dehydration and the water. It was still a problem, but it was not something that just broke them. He was prepared for it. Now, and there's details missing from Daeron's campaign that we will eventually hopefully get in Fire and Blood 2, aka Blood and Fire, and we'll return to that topic then, but some of those details aren't given. It's just implied strongly that though the sun was nasty, they didn't suffer nearly as much as this army was due to better preparations. So that's how that's how it was going for the Tyrell army, very badly. What about the new Lord of Storm's End, Orys Baratheon? How is it going in the Boneway? Quote:
Orys Baratheon's attack fared little better.
Oh.
Oh, sorry, you just said something that threw me off. Orys Baratheon's attack fared little better. His horses struggled on the stony slopes of the narrow, twisting passes, but many balked completely when they reached the steepest section of the road, where the Dornish had chiseled steps into the mountains. Boulders rained down on the Hand's knights from above, the work of defenders the Stormlanders never saw. Where the Boneway crossed the River Will, Dornish archers suddenly appeared as the column was making its way across a bridge, and arrows rained down by the thousands. When Lord Orys ordered his men to fall back, a massive rockfall cut off their retreat. With no way forward and no way back, the Stormlanders were butchered like hogs in a pen. Orys Baratheon himself was spared, along with a dozen other lords thought worth the ransom, but they found themselves captives of Will, the savage mountain lord called Widow Lover.
Fared little better, it says. That's an understatement. They were, quote, butchered like hogs in a pen. Yeah, they fared about as bad as it could. Yeah,
it seems like they fared much worse. I'm almost confused by that phrasing, that there must be something more to this or something. Like, I legit wonder if there was a portion of the army that didn't get trapped between the boulder fall or whatever. Because
I don't know. Yeah, it is such an understatement. I mean, technically, more men died on the way to Hellholt because there was just so many more of them. So maybe that's the point. Like, up to like 4,000 men died on that march, and this was all of them that died in this one, but there's only 1,000 of them. So, like, arguably, more loss of life. I don't know, but either way, it's if you're a Targaryen or Baratheon fan, that's about as bad as it gets. If you're a Dornish fan, you're like, yeah, get him. That was great. What a win, you know. Terrain being used to huge advantage when done properly. Picture it. It says you're crossing a bridge over a river. This isn't some large stone bridge. Surely it might even be like a rope bridge, but it might be a wooden bridge or something. Anyway, so obviously there's only so many people that can cross at once. You don't have like masses of men all crossing the bridge at once. At least you shouldn't.
I mean, make it a big stone bridge. Still, how many people are getting across at a time? Still, what do you do when the arrows start raining down? You know?
Yeah, and it seems as if from nowhere these arrows start raining down. It would be a panic, maybe, but at worst, but at best, people are hurrying quickly and unable to get off quick enough to get cover. So some people may have some shields and they're doing what they can. But then you're getting close to, let's say you're one of the men in that press and you manage to escape. You get off the bridge and you're retreating back away from the bridge, and then an avalanche comes at you the direction you're fleeing in. A full-blown rock avalanche, and the arrows are still flying. Then you look around you and you realize there is no way out. You are completely trapped. You've got a gorge and a active rock fall. And then the noose is tightening because the soldiers that have you surrounded are getting closer as you are suffering more, and as the chaos increases, and as the officers are trying to get some semblance of like forming up, get your shields up, this and that, but people are just too panicked. They're probably not listening. Now, instead of just arrows, you've got spears and javelins because it's closer. By the time people are in hand-to-hand fighting, there's probably barely any resistance. I doubt Lord Will lost many of his warriors that day. Probably very few, maybe none. It's quite possibly they had 0 casualties, something like that. It was just such an effective ambush. It's actually, I would rarely consider such a overwhelming success, but this is possible. So, and partly because it's a small army, only 1,000 men, and that made it easier to encircle them. On one hand, they didn't need as many supplies, and some maybe that they were being smart. But if they had brought a lot of men, that would have been used against them. If they brought a fewer men, that was used against them. It just goes to show how kind of impossible the whole thing was, given their strategy. Maybe if they had done it differently. But yeah, so the Stormmen suffered huge losses during that portion of the conquest. So maybe this was another factor as to why his portion of the army was so small. Whatever reasons there were, though, it clearly didn't work out. The Will of Will is called Widow Lover in that quote and elsewhere, and he is named, quote, a savage mountain lord as well there. The mountain lord part speaks for itself. He is literally a lord of a castle in the mountains. His family has known the area for countless generations. he's got to know all these routes, hidden passes, tunnels, just everything. I mean, they've been there so long. They know all the stuff, all the routes. They even maybe made their own tunnels in a few spots here and there. And that's going to matter because Aegon will be very unhappy with the will of Will. And for this and other reasons. But it's hard to punish a savage mountain lord who has tunnels he can hide in. And yes, the will of Will he's not going to truly get a comeuppance. Maybe his descendants, however, that's another matter. So we'll be certainly coming back to this character. This reminds me, we made a lot of comparisons to real world and other fantasy. It's time for one of those here. We got the Fremen and Dune. This is kind of how I picture the will of Will. These guys are a little more bloodthirsty, I think. The Fremen are a little more composed and a little more disciplined. And other things, but the sudden attacks, the making the land their own, like being part of it, knowing it extremely well, adapting, making it really harsh for invaders, concealing their numbers really well. That's a thing in Dune. The Harkonnens dramatically underestimate how many Fremen there are.
I was going to say, being underestimated in the first place. I think that's another thing that Aegon did well earlier that he and his forces are doing poorly now is gathering intelligence, just scouting out and prepping for what's to come. They just went in too quick, too unprepared.
You can't scout caves. You can you may not even know the cave is there, let alone what's in it. It's hard. Like a lot of their natural advantages were neutralized. Like the dragons can't. At best, a dragon might see them going into the cave, but how big the cave is, how deep it goes, yeah, you're not scouting that. Well, we saw the entrance. That's about all we know. So, and then Nina makes another comparison here about the struggle of the horses in the narrow mountain passes. Think of Stannis' knights struggling in the snow on the march to Winterfell. Just a completely opposite type of weather condition, but a very similar result in terms of how the horses struggle and what ends up happening to them. Some of them end up dying. Now, Orys had a battle like this. Remember, he had the first conflict when he marched his army towards Storm's End before the final climactic engagement with King Argilac was an ambush at the Wendwater, and they lost there. Remember, they weren't ready for it. They were kind of caught off guard. Looks like maybe Orys isn't great at detecting ambushes. This is, he got ambushed there, he got ambushed here. But hey, when you're a High Lord, you have a reasonable expectation that they're not going to kill you. And he was right. They took him captive. Maybe there was a little bit of that inborn arrogance there. It's like, well, the worst won't happen to me. It'll happen to everybody else maybe. But honestly, of course, I don't think he expected any of this to happen. I think he just expected to win.
It took a little luck, too, to not be killed. Like, even if you are this wealthy, highborn person that's more valuable to be ransomed or whatever, you still just might accidentally get shot by an arrow. Or just some overzealous warrior just keeps swinging his sword and isn't thinking about ransoms. He just wants to kill the bad guy. There's all kinds of things that have to work out just right to be captured instead of killed in battle.
You're totally right. There's been plenty of cases where someone in Orys' position was killed in battle, and you're right. And then they might have regretted it because, like, damn, that would have been a big ransom. But you're right. Heat of battle's also a hell of a drug. So another thing, of course, Orys had with him in the Stormlands was Meraxes, who he does not have. Rhaenys and Meraxes nowhere near at this point. They're all the way over near the Planky Town, nowhere near the Boneway. So there's the Tyrell host, the Baratheon host, which is no more, and King Aegon's host. Let's see how he was doing while one was struggling and the other was gone. Quote,
King Aegon himself had more success. Sorry, I got to break the quote. Not hard to do, right?
yeah.
The bar was low.
The bar was low.
Sorry, okay. King Aegon himself had more success. Marching eastward through the foothills, where runoff from the heights provided water and game was plentiful in the valleys, he took the castle Skyreach by storm. One Ironwood, after a brief siege. The Lord of the Tor had recently died, and his steward surrendered without a fight.
So that's 3 castles. Fowler, Ironwood, and Jourdain, all kind of heading east towards Sunspear. You kind of crossed through all those. Meanwhile, though, the Tyrell host has been severely weakened and hasn't accomplished anything, and Orys' army is gone. He would have expected to meet Orys' army, because Aegon goes through the Western Pass and goes east. So he would have expected Orys would have come along there and linked up at some point. But of course, that never happened. He would have been left wondering what happened to Orys. Where's Orys? I don't know. And there would be maybe no word ever. I'm kind of thinking maybe the Wills would have maybe sent a head or two, but they might have just preferred to do nothing and let them stew and wonder. Be like, where's our Stormlander army? And as days pass, as there's nowhere, true deathly silence there, they'd be like, the wonder would be greater. And maybe some people in the army would be like, yeah, didn't we have Stormlander allies? Didn't I hear something about that? And then they just would never appear. And it'd be like, well, it's a campaign. Things change, plans change. But it would be kind of ominous. It'd be like, what happened to the Stormlanders? Where are they? And is that going to happen to us?
It would be much smarter, I think, to not let them know at all, because they're more likely to make mistakes without the information, right?
Okay.
They're not sure how much water they should be preserving for this army that might come needing it. They're not sure how long they should wait before moving out. Things like this. The longer they wait, the more likely they are to make bad decisions based on not knowing what they need to do next, and the worse morale gets.
Yes, that's a very good point. And there might be attempts to keep the armies from contacting each other. That might be a specific plan of the Dornish, is to use some of their guerrilla attacks on messengers. Like, ravens aren't very useful in a situation like this because you can't send ravens to an army in the field. Now, when the army gets to Hellholt, it could maybe send a raven all the way back to King's Landing or something like that. But that's still very slow, even slower than normal communication. And if they're going to send horse couriers back and forth, well, for one thing, that's particularly difficult when you're in the desert. Like, you've gone all the way through the deep desert. I don't know if you can send a lot of messages back and forth, especially because you don't necessarily know where to send them. You don't know where Aegon's army necessarily is. It's somewhere north of you heading east. And if I'm the Dornish, I'm doing everything I can to stop those messages going back and forth. So like you say, Sean, the best play might be to just let them stew on it. And it's tempting to rub it in their faces because they want to, it's part of their psychological warfare is to lower morale. But this restraint might actually have a greater effect. I like that thought, as dark as it is. So Aegon probably doesn't know. He doesn't know about how bad it's going for the Tyrell army. He doesn't know about the wipeout of the Stormlander army. So this applies to the lower level guys too. This like what happened to the Stormlander army is going to apply to the knights and lords, but the lower levels troops also. Everything we talked about in the Prince's Pass with the sheep and the food and the anxiety, now it's getting worse. It's still getting worse despite a few victories, because they're starting to think like, you tell yourself you're winning, right? You're taking all these castles. You've taken 3 of the biggest, most famous Dornish castles without a fight. At the first one, you're like, yeah. The second one, you're like, all right. But about the third one, you're like, something's not right about this. They're not just cowardly, are they? This is some plan, and I don't know what it is. And I'm starting to get scared of what it might mean, given all these other ominous signs here and there. And it's like, they're not actually afraid, are they? Because, like, you don't do the sheep wall if you're afraid. You don't do night attacks if you're afraid. Like, the whole narrative, they're afraid of us, is going to be harder and harder to sell to the troops.
Or even if you do still think they're afraid, that's a coward's tactic to ambush us at night and to block the path with sheep, all this other stuff. But at some point, when you're dying of thirst and your horse is dead and 1/3 of your army is dead, and like, okay, now we're afraid. I hope we don't have to meet them in the field, right?
Yeah.
That was the whole idea in the beginning. They're scared to meet us in the field. Well, at this point, they're probably scared to meet them in the field.
Yeah, you get to that point where like, actually, I just want to go home. Thank you. Yeah. Also, does it kind of seem like Aegon gave himself the easiest job? Like, he didn't go through the Bone Way. That's the hard one. And then he didn't have to go through the deep desert. He gets to go through the more lush part of Dorne. So it's like, yeah, well, that's what you get to do when you're the king. Not that Balerion would have been much help in the desert anyway, or probably not all that helpful in the mountains. It's too large, that a smaller dragon might have actually been better, But either
hindsight
way.
is 2020. Like, the way it turned out, It sure seems like that, but I wonder if he had split the forces differently, if he had stayed with the troops going through the pass, maybe the dragon could have blown fire in the outskirts, or seen, the dragon in the air could have collected more intelligence or something that might have made that battle go differently. And whatever forces did what he did might have been more vulnerable. I'm not sure how true that is, but you got to at least take that into account, that it's possible that we're being results oriented here.
I agree. Yeah. And it's entirely possible as well that it's just a strategy thing. Like if he had used Balerion differently, it might have, different things might have happened, but he used him, he kind of waited for an army, I guess. And then one never came. So he just wasn't deployed. Like you don't really hear about Balerion doing anything during any of this because the Dornish correctly give Balerion nothing to do. They're like, well, if you want to burn a castle or two, you can do that. We can't stop you from that. But you're not going to win the war by melting castles,
Yes, this is time when Balerion might have been most useful as a messenger.
Yeah, it's like it may be kind of unthinkable to use Balerion as a messenger, but that might have been the smarter play. It's like, oh, my dragon is no messenger. Well, maybe you should reconsider your hoity-toity thoughts on this, Aegon. Remember, too, if we go back to Daeron the First, the young dragon, they were like, can you take Dorne without dragons? He's like, well, I'm the dragon. But as I'm showing here, the dragons weren't actually that big a deal. I mean, they did a lot of devastation. They were a big deal, but they didn't really move the needle towards winning the war. It was other factors. And of course, they didn't ever really win the war. They temporarily declared victory. Both of these stories, both Daeron and Aegon, said, hey, I guess I win. And then they were proven wrong by what came next. But Daeron did do some things smarter. Like he showed that navies maybe are even better than dragons, which goes to show that Aegon should have done both. Nina raises an idea here that isn't in the book, but could have been. It may be something that was discussed but didn't make the history books. It's the kind of thing that you would expect would have been talked about. Would have been maybe Aegon considering granting primacy over Dorne to someone else, like making a deal with the Ironwoods. Right? The Ironwoods have always thought, even now, as far as we know, that they're superior to the Martells, that they deserve to be the top spot in Dorne. So with that in mind, and that's a well-known thing. I mean, after all, the Ironwoods did split with the Martells during the Blackfires rebellions, right? They were like, well, maybe this is our chance to jump over the Martells. Was that a consideration here? Against that argument is the fact that Aegon doesn't work like that, right? That's more of a winning through politics. He wants to win through strength. He wants to dominate you in a way that shows he's stronger, not in a way that shows he's cleverer or smarter, although I'm sure those things matter to him. But number one is I'm stronger. And cutting deals to win a war it's a form of strength, it's political power, but it's not the I beat you in the field idea that Aegon wants to really establish, that he really wants to drive home. So maybe he thought about that idea of making the Ironwood say, hey, Ironwood, take our side, be our man on the inside, and we'll make you top dogs. They may have abandoned the idea because they didn't think it would work as well. Maybe the Ironwoods of that era were not open to that sort of thing. They're like, no, we're Dornish. We're not turning on our own people. Whereas, 180 years later, when Dorne was already part of the realm, it's a different consideration for the Ironwoods of that era to join with the Blackfires, because you're really just picking one side of the Targaryen family. You're not throwing them off entirely, right? That's the difference here. This is against other Dornishmen, whereas it's more Dorne split in half during the Blackfire rebellions. They're more fighting over the throne rather than each other. So, the Jourdain steward, in fact, when he surrendered, this was the third one, that may have even reminded them of the Tyrell surrender of Highgarden. It's like, well, maybe that's what I have to do. If the top house isn't going to capitulate, I make someone else the top house. That's kind of what happened in the Riverlands, too. He's like, well, the Harren the Black didn't capitulate. House Horror is gone now, or almost gone. So, Tully's, you're up next. You get to be top dog now. So it's not like he hadn't done sort of similar things elsewhere, but I'm not sure it's what he wanted. I think he preferred to just take on the top dog and have them bend the knee to him. Let's talk about how he declared victory. He continued east towards Sunspear, continuing to meet basically no resistance or odd resistance. He took major sites in his path, and here's what came next.
Farther east, Lord Tolland of Ghost Hill sent forth his champion to challenge the king to single combat. Aegon accepted and slew the man, only to discover afterward that he had not been Tolland's champion, but his fool. Lord Tolland himself was gone.
This is just weird, right? I don't get it, right? It's strange. I don't understand what they hope to accomplish by this, right? But start from the beginning. Picture it. A lot of lords might have been sweating this duel. They're like, oh my, our king, who has no heir, don't forget, is gonna duel someone. They might be a little anxious about that. Some of them would be confident because Aegon is just so strong and he is a great warrior. They probably wouldn't. They might not have been too worried. Like, they've never heard of this Toland champion. Who is this guy? He's nobody. More true than they thought. He's really, truly nobody. If it were written like with prose, it might start like Gregor versus Oberyn or Strong Belwas versus the hero of Meereen, only for it to turn into a complete dud. You're like, wait, that wasn't... Who was that? That guy didn't look like he even knows how to fight. How long did it take for them to figure out that he was the fool? Like, they didn't just realize that right away. Like, Aegon wins, and they're like, well, that was easy. What's going on here? And what was it that took his armor off, and underneath there's motley? Like, what... What was the moment in which they realized he was the fool? Were there any Dornishmen watching? Like, they might wonder also, you know, it's the king, the Targaryen king is fighting a duel against, it's a fool. So maybe they didn't watch because they knew what was going to happen. But maybe if they don't watch, doesn't that kind of give away that something is up? Right? Like, why aren't any Dornishmen watching this duel? And how does this come to play? Like, did they just leave this fool behind? Like, okay, fool, we got to get out of here, but we need someone to stay behind to create a distraction. But that doesn't make a lot of sense. They knew Aegon was coming weeks ahead of time, probably. So I don't really understand it. Was it meant to annoy Aegon, to embarrass him, to shame him himself? Like, look at this. He's killing fools. Look at how weak he is. He's got to kill fools to make himself look strong because he can't fight real warriors. Like, yeah, I really don't understand. And this is when they changed their banner to a dragon chasing its tail. It had been a ghost because their Ghost Hill is their location. So when they gather to commemorate this trick of their brave fool, what exactly are they celebrating? Like, that fool, he sure did die pointlessly. Like, I don't know what this accomplished.
I made a fool of him. I mean, it makes me think, honestly, of the humiliation tactic that they used in this season of Fargo, without any spoilers, but the idea that when you have a powerful man, humiliating him and making him look a fool to other people can really...
it hurts more than you might think because he's so proud.
Yeah, he's so proud. His proud,
okay.
Like, his power is a big part. His power is a big part of his power, but yeah, like, his status is a part of his power. And yeah, I think it was meant to humiliate
word spread
him.
that Aegon dueled a fool.
Yeah, dueled a fool. But yeah, I think it would. I think Dornishmen probably sing songs about this. There probably is a Dornish song about this exact thing. It gives heart to their people. Yeah, I think that even if it doesn't stop things in its tracks, but it helps.
Yeah, maybe
Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah, we lost you for a minute there, but yeah,
Yep.
you're back
Sorry
now.
about that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that's Nina writes, maybe I'm assuming too much about their ability to get away. Maybe they didn't have as much warning, or maybe he moved quickly, and maybe they didn't know for sure he'd come for them because he was heading for Sunspear, and maybe they gambled that he wouldn't bother with them. So who knows? Now, interestingly enough, too, there's House Tolland has a dragon dreamer in their family right now, and it's kind of a mystery how that happened.
Well, I have my
There's
theory,
possibilities,
yeah.
but it is interesting. It's not like a completely impenetrable mystery, but it's
No.
it's interesting to tie these anecdotes together and wonder if they're
considering the Targaryens, they've married into Dorne.
yeah.
It makes sense that someone from that
A Martell
lineage,
Tolland match.
Exactly. Rather, the Martells.
And
then
Daenerys
married
had a
the
lot of
Tollans.
children, so
Yeah, so that's my choice, my theory there. I just think it makes great sense that the Martells, the Tollans would marry, and the Targaryens share their blood with the Dornish, and so now they'll pop up around Dorne potentially. There's other houses that could happen to it, you know?
Yeah, and it really does open that possibility up that could happen somewhere else, like other Dornish house maybe, or something here and there. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I mean, it's also true. I mean, I guess any houses where like a Targaryen has married into, I think in that region, the people like marriages they could make, you could speculate that like that is the case there as well.
Yeah, and there's a couple other possibilities. Yeah, maybe Aegon. Nina writes that fighting when Aegon finds out the champion was a fool, he would look like a fool himself. You know, like he was duped into this. Whether or not like there's multiple things that are embarrassing about it, I guess. Yeah, maybe I underestimated the embarrassment suffered by him. I like your example of Fargo. That's a good one.
Yeah, it did embarrass him.
yeah, he was very embarrassed by that. It was like to like a regular person, it's just like it's like a prank. You know, you're like, oh, that's funny, but like to someone who's really wrapped up in their own ego and their own reputation respected. Is so important and respected, and to have that. To damage that damages his kingship even. So, yeah, pretty cool. But it is possible that this fool it says this guy's mad. He might have genuinely wanted to fight Aegon. Like, there's still the idea of, like, how did they get this guy to do it? Like, even, like, did the fool really... Like, you can order a man to do it, but, like, how is he going to, like, have the courage to actually do it? You know, he might just be like, I'm too afraid of this, man. I know you're ordering me to do it, but I'm just going to run away. You know, I don't want to fight this guy. He really did face him and die.
He's a fool.
He is a fool. Yeah. But there is, you know, there are a few real world examples of things like this. There was a knight in William the Conqueror's army, I believe it was, who there's a story where this guy just like launched himself at the opposing army by himself in between like forays, like the two armies were separated, and this guy just like launched himself forward and was like naked or something. I forget all the details, but he was just someone just went mad. He charged by himself, and of course he died, you know. It was just really weird. But again, so many things that are weird that happen in Westeros history. There's something just as weird in a nearly identical way that happened in the real world, and which might in fact be the inspiration for that. And we already have a legend of Florian the Fool. There's already a popular Westerosi legend, one of the most popular stories, one of the most memorable like fables of Westeros, or legends, whatever you want to call it. I don't think they use the word fable, but still, it's a appropriate term. So Dorne they know Florian the Fool down in Dorne. I mean, Tansel the Tall, she puts on Florian the Fool as one of her puppet shows in the Hedge Knight. And yeah, any fool can be a great knight according to this legend. So maybe this crazy fool was even thinking of himself as a true Florian. Maybe they refer to him as their Florian, because we don't know what this guy's name was. Florian Tolland, the mad fool. Well, he wouldn't have been a Tolland probably, but Florian of the Tollands. Yeah. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, it's kind of neat little story. It's both weird and interesting and quirky and just, yeah. It's kind of interesting that he even accepted the duel in the first place, though not too surprising given he wants to show himself as a dominator, and he had already done it. He had already dueled a few other people. Like, I think the most recent one had been at Volmark. In the Iron Islands, or maybe not Volmark, maybe Blacktide, I forget. But he fought one of those guys in a duel in the Iron Islands during that episode. So yeah,
I still think it is, by the way, a little odd. Like it maybe even necessary, but it's a bit of a risk. You know, he's got to really think he's better than the best of Dorne. Maybe, never mind. Maybe it wasn't the same reputation at that time, but maybe the fear of poisoning too. You know, like. Maybe he just had enough confidence in his armor and his blade and his training, and maybe there would have been instructions for someone with a bow and arrow to like, I was stop maybe a final like blow from being dealt. But you know. Yeah,
maybe there was like I would have expected maybe it was an assassination attempt, and you know they just it's surprising how few or no assassination attempts there are at this point, given that there will be lots later. So I wonder if they just like flipped the switch, like okay. we're not like this, but now we are. But I don't really think so. I mean, they were totally willing to do night attacks and all these other like guerrilla warfare stuff. I don't know why they'd scruple to not try to murder the king or one of the queens.
Well, maybe because they were afraid if they did that he would ruthlessly burn cities down.
Yeah.
But once they're ruthlessly burning cities down anyway, okay, fine, we're going to try to poison you.
I agree, because I think their idea was to get them to leave. And if you kill the king, they're not going to leave. They're going to, like you say, get really vicious and bloody and murderous. On the other hand, killing the king might end the war. So there is like, it's a calculated.
But it might attract 2 more dragon riders.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, one was already there. So what the other dragon rider. Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way. So, and from Aegon's perspective, like they keep not facing him. Finally, someone's willing to fight him. You know, it's just a duel. It's not an army, but it's something that he can go, all right, I'll win this. It's something I can plant my flag in and be like, look, here's a victory. It's me personally winning it. I didn't send someone else to do it, only for it to be embarrassing because it was a fool. So he's like, finally, all right, someone was going to fight me, but oops, nope, not that happened. Maybe he was still convincing himself they were afraid at this point. And then at this point, he's like, okay, this isn't fear. They're messing with me. They're just doing asymmetrical warfare, which may be something he wasn't that familiar with. He certainly didn't use that term, asymmetrical warfare. But he started I wonder at which point he realized that this just wasn't working, or whether they're not playing by quote unquote the rules of warfare he was used to, whether that would ultimately result in some other outcome. Because as we're going to see, he's just going to declare victory without really ever beating the people he came to beat. So it was said Lord Tallinn had gone away, right? And all these other lords before. That quote continues here.
As was Miriam Martell, the Princess of Dorne, when King Aegon descended upon Sunspear on Balerion to find his sister Rhaenys there before him. After burning the Planky Town, she had taken lemonwood, spotswood, and stinkwater, accepting obeisance from old women and children, but nowhere finding an actual enemy. Even the Shadow City outside the walls of Sunspear was half deserted, and none of those who remained would admit to any knowledge of the whereabouts of the Dornish lords and princess. The yellow toad has melted into the sands, Queen Rhaenys told King Aegon. Aegon's answer was a declaration of victory.
Yeah, so it's another example of overconfidence, quite possibly. Like they're thinking, well, we win. They didn't face us, so we win. It's that simple. We've got their capital. It's like capture the flag. Like they left it sitting here. We took it. We win, right? Given the rules of warfare they're used to, that's ingrained in their minds, this is a victory. But it's not. Maybe it's just a political statement. Like, well, they refuse to admit they've lost, so we're just going to loudly declare victory because it's the best we can do? What are we going to do? Say, well, I guess we didn't win after all? What's he going to declare non-victory? I mean, he's got to do something. But as we've said, Sean, in many different ways, running away isn't giving up. They're still fighting. It's just they're just not fighting frontal warfare. Nina brings up another real-world example here. King William III in the Glorious Revolution. He was facing the invasion of his daughter and son-in-law, King James II. He just facing the invasion of his daughter and son-in-law, King James II of England, fled to France, which he threw the Great Seal, which is like the royal insignia. He threw it into the Thames. He just threw it in the river. William and his government thereafter decided to say that by fleeing abroad and abandoning the Great Seal, he had abdicated. Like by doing that, you have declared you're no longer the king. They just took that as a sign of capitulation. So they just made up a rule. They're like, if you do that, that means you're not king anymore. And a lot of people would buy that because, again, they're the ones who have the voice. They're the ones making the narrative, and no one else can argue with them. They have the armies and the voices and the pens and paper making these declarations. Whether the other armies and other kings and lords and ladies agree with that is another matter, and the declaration isn't going to affect that over much, although it may affect some people in the middle and what side they take. So yeah, it's better than admitting that their strategy was a failure. Better admitting that the Dornish had outmaneuvered them. Say, hey, we're in your castle, so we win. It's better optics, I guess, even though it's not necessarily the truth.
At the time, it would have felt like the truth. It's easier, again, for us to look at it with 2020 hindsight. But why would they not think they won when they're in the castle of their opponent?
Yeah, right, yeah.
So.
I guess it's because there's still so many Dornish out there who had not capitulated. But I guess the rest of Westeros doesn't know that. Like from in the Stormlands, in the Reach, and taverns all around Westeros, all they're hearing is that the king is in Sunspear now. Like, well, he must have. They might even assume some battle was won to do that. They might not have heard the part about no one was there. They just walked in. That part might not have been part of the rumor. It might have just been some victory or other might have been assumed. So in addition to this very sketchy declaration of victory, Aegon's plan to rule Dorne afterwards also has some very glaring red flags that I think a lot of you will identify right away here in this quote.
In the great hall at Sunspear, he gathered together what dignitaries remained and told them that Dorne was now part of the realm, that henceforth they would be his loyal subjects, that their former lords were rebels and outlaws. Rewards were offered for their heads, particularly that of the Yellow Toad, Princess Maria Martell. Lord John Rosby was named Castellan of Sunspear and Warden of the Sands. To rule Dorne in his name... Warden of the Sands to rule Dorne in the king's name. Stewards and castellans were named for all of the lands and castles the conqueror had taken. Then King Aegon and his host departed back the way they had come, west along the foothills and through the Prince's Pass. They had hardly reached King's Landing before Dorne erupted behind them.
Yeah, so this is what we were saying before, is that they were trying to lull Aegon into declaring a premature victory and then leaving, and then that would enable them to slaughter everyone he left behind, which is exactly what happened. Maybe Aegon thought he was clever putting in Lord Rosby in charge, because that's not a Stormlander, not a Reachman. It's like, well, they won't hate him as much. Yeah, they don't have grudges against lords north of the Blackwater, right? Actually, yeah, they do, because he's an invader. Like, they might hate a Stormlander more, but it's like that million degrees a day thing. It's still well over the bar for hating him. Hating more doesn't make that much difference. You know, he's still an invader. You know, this man is not going to rule over them if they have any say of it. And, well, here's what happens next. Quote,
Dornish spearmen appeared from nowhere like desert flowers after a rain. Skyreach, Ironwood, the Tor, and Ghost Hill were all recaptured within a fortnight, their royal garrisons put to the sword. Aegon's castellans and stewards were allowed to die only after long torment. It was said that the Dornish lords had a wager over who could keep their captive alive the longest whilst dismembering them. Lord Rosby, Castellan of Sunspear and Warden of the Sands, had a kinder end than most. After the Dornishmen swarmed in from the Shadow City to retake the castle, he was bound hand and foot, dragged to the top of the Spear Tower, and thrown from a window by none other than the aged Princess Miria herself.
This, to me, probably was a bit like King Viserys killing the stag in House of the Dragon, where it's just all set up for him, and all he has to do is just, like, stab it. They're basically holding it in place for him. This is probably what it was. Like, Mary is, again, like, in her 80s, so she probably just, like, barely pushes him, and they're just, like, they set him, like, so he's able to topple right out, you know? But it's pretty nasty, but these are unprovoked invasions. These are home destroyers. I mean, this is vicious. This is vicious versus vicious, and they're led by, again, ancestral foe, traumatic legends, right? Dornish, Rhoynar, they're going to have sympathy for people who are opposing Valyrians, dragons, Targaryens on general principle. This is an ancient enemy. And they want to intimidate people. Intimidation, psychological warfare, all this stuff is in place. This is part of their plan because they can't win through the traditional conservative frontal assault means. They have to use what they have, and this is what they have. Like what happened to Orys Baratheon's army, there was a psychological plan in mind here. It wasn't just pure savagery, it was savage strategy. Savagery. I don't know. There's a word in there somewhere that can be made.
I mean, it's sort of terrorism, like in modern terms or modern rules of warfare or whatever. A lot of what both sides are doing, honestly. I was going to say, what would they have done with that Rosby guy if they had a grudge against? What if he was a Reachman?
Yeah, that's the difference it makes. Like, had a kinder end than most. He only fell to his death. Yeah, he would have been, if he had been a Stormlander or a Reachman, yeah, I think they might have tortured him more, yeah.
By the way, don't blow off that line, bound hand and foot and dragged up can you imagine? That's like literally being beaten with the bat 1,000 times maybe. Like every step of your body being smacked as you get bound. No way to protect your face or anything, that would be awful.
Yeah, that's real bad. So it was called the Defenestration of Sunspear, and the calendar had shifted to AC5 by the time it happened, so we can roughly about a year, I guess, this portion of the war was, maybe a little less. Certainly not 2, though. You got to give them some style points and symbol points for that last one, as gnarly as all this is. Maria doing it herself, given all her infirmities and how old she is, like, it really shows that the Dornish will resist to the last. And using different means than what would be accepted northwards, right? Like, even the old women are in the fight, is kind of what it symbolizes. Even the oldish women who are in their society are perhaps the weakest, which is not true, but they might see it that way. Even they will stand up to these knights, to these lords of the other kingdoms. And that's the face that Dorne puts on this, that they will resist. Even the quote-unquote weakest of them will resist and fight, and this is what happens. So the farther south and west, the Tyrell army under Lord Harlan mobilized. Here's how we recall how difficult things are in the Hellhole. We did an episode, like you said, Sean, hardcore houses pretty recently. We spoke of it in a few places besides that as well. The Highgarden episode, it came up a bit. And remember, that army already wasn't at full strength, so that was a bad time, right? So they were already weakened by who knows how much. And the Corgyles, interestingly, another hardcore house, had never submitted at all. No one ever came to them and said, hey, you give up now, right? They were like, no, we're in the deep desert. No one even bothered to come to us because we're so far off the beaten path. So they were still like attacking Hellholt here and there, sending raiding parties in, attacking their food supplies. But eventually they heard, the Hellholt Tyrells heard about the defenestration, got that beaten up, understaffed, sick army, and headed east to go to Vaith and vanished. I think you all remember this one. That's been cited a few times. So all of that army's gone. All of that Baratheon force, gone. A part of Aegon's army destroyed as well because he had some losses here and there. He didn't go through the deep deserts and but still, he left men behind as garrisons, all of which were destroyed to a man. So I'm going to guess that out of about 31,000 fighting men that went into Dorne, only about 12,000 survived. So about 19,000 or so died. Not to mention the officials, tax collectors, all the other folks who came afterwards, and non-combatants who also died because they weren't the only ones. It wasn't just the soldiers dying of starvation. Or rather of thirst and heat. Some of the camp followers as well, and just people sharpening the weapons and providing the food. They would have been suffering just as badly and maybe even worse because a lot of times the soldiers are considered more important. So yeah. All right. It's a decent spot to leave it. The ending of the army and the sort of finishing of the first portion of this war. Next time up, we'll start by discussing some of the strategy and why some of these things went wrong, both in terms of navies and dragons, and then get into the non-traditional aspect of this war, the part that lasted the longest, the assassinations, the subterfuge, the cloak and dagger, the really dirty and savage and bloody and brutal portions of this war that are really kind of unlike anything else in the history of Westeros. It's very unique. Maybe only A Song of Ice and Fire itself fits as a parallel to some of the stuff that we're going to get into next time.
When you talk about 1,000 men trapped on a bridge getting butchered like pigs, and then you say next time we're going to get into the really brutal part. Jeez.
Yeah, I guess it's not really, as it isn't worse in that sense. It's just a different form of brutal. It's a different brand of brutal. Yeah, it's more of the murdering and torturing and less of the just.
I would say it may even be more brutal because those soldiers all were soldiers going to war, and I guess maybe they didn't all exactly volunteer for it, but a lot more innocent people get destroyed. I guess it was also pretty brutal to burn Planky Town and all these other things. So. I do think that there is some similarly brutal stuff coming up.
Yeah, I think so too. So if you like brutality, we've got the stuff for you. Come back next time. Well, there won't be a new recording next week. We will be at MagFest in Washington, D.C. So if you're going to be there, come say hey.
That is the Music and Gaming Festival.
That's right.
To be clear.
Yes, MAG. Just M-A-G. There's no other letter at the end of that.
Yeah, Music and Gaming. So yeah, if you're in Maryland area, we will be there. Hope to see you there.
Yeah, we're driving on up. That's right. So we'll be back in 2 weeks for the second half of the First Dornish War. And today's trivia question. Remember, House Tolland is now a dragon chasing its tail, but it was a ghost for Ghost Hill. That's right. Which is one of the only reasons we know ghosts are a thing in all of Westeros, because the only other ghost I can think of is Jon pretending to be a ghost by covering himself in flour, so clearly that's a thing that he was trying to be.
And the word "ghost of High Heart."
Yeah, the word comes up in other places. You're right.
Saying it,
but I mean, like the personification of a ghost. Like, what do they look like? Like we think of the sheet, the white.
I think they look like a big white direwolf.
Yeah.
With red eyes, it never makes a sound. Oh yeah. So that's So I don't know. So when I picture a sigil of Ghost Hill, I'm like, what is that ghost? What did it look like? Was it like a Casper, or was it what does a Westerosi ghost image
Slimer.
look like? It was Slimer. It was green. Yeah. Well, it's a green dragon on their new one, so it would be consistent to have a green ghost. So yeah. Other episodes that you might want to check out to keep immersed on this topic include Nymeria, both episodes 1 and 2. One day we'll do the third one, which is her conquest of Dorne itself. The first two are the different phases of the Rhoynish Odyssey. Daron the First, the young dragon, we've got an episode on him. We talked about him a few times this episode. We mentioned the High Garden episode. We mentioned Hardcore Houses a couple times. But there's so many other Targaryen-related episodes and Dorne-related episodes you could find in our catalog. Anything from ancient Dorne all the way to episodes about Valyria and Targaryen-related houses like House Velaryon and House Celtigar. And, of course, don't forget the Last Storm episode, available for patrons and members only, and the Red Kraken episode, which takes place during the Dance of the Dragons, and is such a story that functions on its own that we decided to tell that tale separately. It's a bonus episode, and we did it with Radio Westeros alongside the rest of our Dance of the Dragons series, which is available to everyone. Yes, right. Red Kraken and Last Storm episodes, good example of bonus scripted episodes you get by joining us on Patreon. And thanks to those of you who do support us there and on Spotify. You get those bonus episodes if you're a Spotify subscriber as well. Thanks again to Nina for the great notes. Lots of great takes on politics and parallels in history. Sorry?
I have a cat in my lap currently.
Oh, look at that. Yeah, she's black, so we can't tell very well. That's a camo cat right there. Well, even when you do that, it's hard to tell she's there.
Thank you. People asked, so there you go.
I'm glad to see our live viewers want more cat action, because we do too. We like it when you all remind us. Aww. I think the cats like it too. They know. Somehow they know that there's a live audience.
I don't know if you can hear her purring.
Oh,
put it close to the speaker.
Cool. Well, everybody, I hope you have a excellent week. We appreciate you listening and being a part of our community. Thanks as well to Michael Klarfeld and Joey Townsend and Jesse and Bran, everyone who helps us with the music and audio and maps and all the great stuff that helps make our show look more professional. We will see you next time. And you know what to do. Until then, I say it every time, I'm not going to stop. Valar, reread us.